In the summer of 1948, Marguerite Guggenheim stood at the window of Palazzo Vigne de' Leoni, looking out over the Grand Canal. She had just purchased the unfinished 18th century mansion for less than it cost her to acquire a single Picasso. The palazzo had no second floor, construction abandoned centuries ago, leaving it stunted, incomplete. She filled the ground floor and garden with paintings and sculptures no Italian museum wanted to display. Neighbors called it an eyesore. She called it home. She was 50 years old. She had spent 3 decades fleeing New York, 2 marriages, countless affairs with artists who needed her money more than her company, and a war she'd watched from the narrow space between witness and opportunist. Now she lived alone with her dogs and her collection, hosting parties for people who came to see the art. The wealth that paid for everything had come from copper mines and smelting plants her grandfather built. She never saw those mines. She never spoke to the men who worked them. The distance between extraction and inheritance was absolute. What she owned was already clean, already converted into the kind of money that bought passports during invasions, and paintings from desperate sellers, and silence from anyone she needed silent. Venice accepted her the way it accepted other exiles, by ignoring her. She would live in that palazzo for 30 years, surrounded by beauty she had purchased but not created, visited by admirers of objects rather than herself. The unease that had followed her since childhood, the sense that she was always somehow the wrong Guggenheim in the wrong room, never lifted. The art stayed, the feeling stayed, nothing else did. Marguerite Guggenheim was born in New York City on August 26, 1898, into a family where wealth had already divided itself into hierarchies she would spend her life trying to climb. Her grandfather Meyer Guggenheim had built an empire from copper and smelting, transforming mineral extraction into one of America's great fortunes. By the time Peggy arrived, the family controlled mines across the American West and South America, refineries that ran without pause, a network of industrial operations that generated money in quantities difficult to spend. But Meyer had 7 sons, and the fortune split accordingly. Peggy's father, Benjamin, was the 4th son. He received his share, millions by any standard. But within the family structure, he occupied a diminished position. The real power consolidated around his older brothers, particularly Daniel and Solomon, who directed the family's mining operations and increasingly its social standing. Benjamin managed a portion of the business, drew his income, but never commanded the central authority that defined the Guggenheim identity in New York society. This mattered more than the money itself. In the insular world of New York's German Jewish elite at the turn of the century, gradations of wealth determined everything: which homes you could enter, which clubs would accept your application, which daughters were suitable matches. The Guggenheims were not Astors or Vanderbilts. They were industrialists. New money built on extraction and labor, tolerated by old New York, but never absorbed into it. Even within that tolerated space, there were Guggenheims who mattered and Guggenheims who merely had money. Peggy grew up understanding this distinction before she had language for it. The family lived well, a brownstone on the Upper East Side, servants, European travel, but not at the scale of her uncles. Solomon was building a mansion. Daniel was expanding the business into Chile. Her father managed investments and appeared at family gatherings where decisions had already been made. She watched him arrive late, leave early, laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny. Her mother, Florette Seligman, came from another prominent German Jewish family, one that considered itself slightly more refined than the Guggenheims. The Seligmans were bankers, not mine operators. They had arrived in America earlier, established themselves with less visible brutality. Florette had married Benjamin, expecting a certain position, and what she received instead was comfort without consequence. She never forgave the discrepancy. Peggy remembered her mother's silence at dinner parties, the way she held her face in photographs, the small corrections she made to Peggy's posture and speech that implied constant inadequacy. There were 3 daughters, Benita, Hazel, and Marguerite. No sons. This fact lived in the household like an additional occupant. Benjamin never said it directly, but the absence shaped everything. Which child received attention, which received instruction, which received the understanding that her primary value would be determined by whom she married. Peggy was the youngest, born after the hope for a male heir had calcified into resigned disappointment. She was not a beautiful child. This became apparent early and was remarked upon often enough that she understood it as fact before she developed defenses against it. Her nose was too prominent, her features too sharp, her body too thin and angular. In a family where marriage represented the primary mechanism for maintaining or elevating social position, physical attractiveness was not vanity. It was currency. Her sisters possessed it. She did not. Benita, the eldest, carried herself with assurance. She knew how to enter rooms, how to angle conversations, how to make men feel attended to without appearing desperate. Hazel was softer, prettier, the kind of daughter mothers displayed with quiet pride. Peggy watched them receive invitations she didn't, saw how adults brightened when they entered and maintained polite neutrality when she followed. School offered no escape. She attended the Jacobi School for Girls, an institution designed for daughters of wealthy German Jewish families. The other students came from the same narrow social band, Lehmans, Loebs, Warburgs, families who had known each other for generations, who had already mapped out which children would eventually marry which other children. Peggy arrived each morning aware that she was among them, but not of them, that her family's position was solid enough for admission, but not for intimacy. She developed no close friendships. Years later, she would describe this period with detachment, as if discussing someone else's childhood. But the isolation marked her permanently. She learned to expect exclusion, to interpret kindness as temporary and conditional, to understand that what she had, money, name, access, could purchase proximity, but not belonging. Her father remained largely absent, occupied with business that never seemed to require his full attention, but consumed his time nonetheless. When he was home, he was gentle, distracted, a man whose natural warmth had been worn down by decades of occupying secondary positions. He gave his daughters gifts, dolls, books, jewelry, objects that substituted for presents. Peggy kept them but understood even then that they represented a form of apology. Her mother's coldness was more active. Florette was not cruel in the overt sense. She did not rage or strike. Instead, she maintained a steady temperature of disappointment, a constancy of correction that made approval impossible to achieve. Peggy's posture was wrong. Her voice was too loud. Her interests were unsuitable. Her appearance required constant management that never quite succeeded. The message was clear. The daughter she had received was not the daughter she had wanted. By the time Peggy entered adolescence, the shape of her life seemed already determined. She would inherit money, not the vast sums that went to male heirs, but enough to live comfortably. She would be expected to marry, though her prospects were limited by her appearance and her family's secondary status. She would occupy the same ambiguous social position her father had, wealthy enough to move in certain circles, but never central to them, never quite the right kind of anything. She began reading obsessively, spending hours in her father's library consuming novels and poetry that described lives entirely unlike her own. The books offered an alternative world where passion and intelligence mattered more than bloodlines and beauty, where women made choices that had consequences beyond matrimony. She believed none of it, but the fantasy provided temporary relief from the certainty that her real life had already been written by forces she could not control. She was 13 years old in 1911, still a child in most respects, still unaware of how completely everything was about to break. Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the RMS Titanic at Cherbourg on April 10, 1912, accompanied by his mistress, a French singer named Léontine Aubard, and his valet, Victor Gilliot. He was returning from business in Europe. His wife and daughters remained in New York, unaware of the woman traveling with him, or perhaps aware in the way that wealthy wives of that era were aware, informed by silence, by separate bedrooms, by the particular courtesy men employed when lying. Peggy learned of the ship sinking the way everyone did, through newspapers that arrived throughout April 15th with increasingly catastrophic updates. First reports suggested damage, but no immediate danger. Then came confirmation that the ship had gone down. Then the survivor lists began appearing, names printed in narrow columns that families scanned with the specific terror of searching for absence. Benjamin Guggenheim's name did not appear among the survivors. What followed was not simple grief. The family received telegrams, condolences, visits from other prominent New York families who understood the social protocol of industrial tragedy. But alongside the sympathy came the stories, accounts from survivors that newspapers published with the detailed enthusiasm that characterized disaster coverage in that era. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Benjamin Guggenheim in the final hours, and their testimonies constructed a narrative that would attach itself to his death permanently. According to these accounts, Benjamin and his valet had initially put on life preservers and gone to the boat deck. They had been offered spaces in the lifeboats. Men of wealth and status often were, despite the women and children protocol. But at some point, whether from genuine nobility or a different calculation entirely, Benjamin returned to his stateroom. He and Giglio changed into evening clothes. They came back on deck wearing full formal attire and reportedly told survivors that they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. The newspapers treated this as heroism. Some accounts claimed Benjamin had helped women and children into lifeboats, that he had given up his place willingly, that his final moments represented the highest ideals of masculine sacrifice. The story spread quickly, embedded itself in Titanic mythology, appeared in memorial services and family eulogies. But other details emerged more slowly, circulated in whispers rather than print. Benjamin had been traveling with his mistress. He had maintained her in Paris for years, an arrangement funded by Guggenheim money while his wife managed their household in New York. The evening clothes, the theatrical gesture of going down as a gentleman, some observers noted that it resembled a performance, the kind of final act a man might stage when he understood that survival would mean returning to face his wife, his brothers, the family structure he had never quite satisfied. Peggy was 13. She absorbed the public narrative and the private one simultaneously, learned that her father's death was both tragedy and scandal, that the heroism everyone praised was inseparable from the infidelity no one mentioned directly. At his memorial service, attended by New York's industrial elite, speakers praised his courage and character. At home, her mother's grief took the form of rigid silence, a refusal to discuss Benjamin beyond the minimum required by social propriety. The financial aftermath was immediate. Benjamin's portion of the Guggenheim fortune passed to his widow and daughters, but the amount was smaller than Florette had expected. The family's wealth was vast in aggregate, but Benjamin's share represented a fraction of the whole. He had lived well, spent freely, maintained establishments in multiple cities. What remained after debts and the Paris apartment and various other arrangements were settled was substantial by ordinary standards, but not by Guggenheim ones. Florette found herself wealthy, but not secure in the way she had assumed. Her daughters would inherit money, but not enough to guarantee the kind of matches she had planned for them. Within the family hierarchy, she and her children slipped further down the ladder. Daniel and Solomon now controlled the mining empire entirely. They were polite to Florette, ensured she had access to family resources, but she was a widow with daughters, and no particular claim on their attention. The social consequences were subtler but persistent. In the years following the Titanic, as the disaster faded from immediate headlines into historical event, the story of Benjamin's death remained attached to him. Some versions emphasized his courage. Others, in private conversations Peggy occasionally overheard, questioned it. Had he really given up his seat, or had he simply missed his chance at the lifeboats? Was the evening dress gesture nobility or theater? Had he chosen death over the humiliation of returning home with his mistress? Peggy never knew which version was true. She suspected no one did. What she knew was that her father's death had become a story that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on who was telling it, and that her family's reputation existed in the space between those interpretations. She learned that wealth did not protect you from being discussed, from having your motives examined, from becoming a character in narratives you couldn't control. At school, girls who had previously ignored her now approached with careful sympathy, the kind that felt less like kindness and more like curiosity about proximity to tragedy. Teachers spoke to her gently, asked if she needed anything, watched her for signs of breakdown that never came. She found the attention unbearable, not because it was unkind, but because it was temporary and performative, a response to spectacle rather than genuine concern for who she was. Her mother's grief, if that's what it was, manifested as increased rigidity. Florette began monitoring her daughters more closely. Their clothing, their comportment, their associations. The message was clear. They could not afford any additional scandal, any misstep that would further damage their position. Benita and Hazel adapted, became more careful, more conventional. Peggy found it impossible. Every correction from her mother felt like an accusation. Every instance of maternal attention a reminder of her father's absence and the circumstances surrounding it. By the time she was 15, Peggy had developed a relationship to her family's wealth that was fundamentally unstable. She knew she had money, would always have money, but she also knew that money had not saved her father, had not bought him a seat on a lifeboat or absolved him of judgment after death. The fortune that surrounded her felt both enormous and insufficient, capable of purchasing almost anything except the things that seemed to actually matter: respect, certainty, a story about yourself that no one could reinterpret. She began to understand that being a Guggenheim meant carrying a weight that was not entirely visible, that the name opened doors but also invited examination, that every action would be measured against standards she had not set and could not meet. Her father had died trying to perform dignity, and even that had been questioned. The years following Benjamin's death settled into a pattern that Peggy would later describe as suffocating, though at the time she lacked the vocabulary to name what she felt. Florette moved the family to a large apartment on Park Avenue, a residence that signaled their continued membership in New York's upper strata while costing less to maintain than the brownstone. The apartment was dark, filled with heavy furniture that Florette had selected for its appearance of permanence. Peggy's bedroom faced an interior courtyard where sunlight arrived filtered in gray. She turned 16 in 1914, the same summer Europe descended into war. The conflict felt distant, abstract, something discussed at dinner parties by men who predicted it would end quickly. What felt immediate was the intensifying pressure around marriage. Benita, now in her early 20s, was being actively courted. Florette managed this process with the precision of someone executing a business transaction, evaluating suitors based on family background, financial stability, and social trajectory. Benita married in 1916 to a man whose primary qualification seemed to be that his family had been in America longer than the Guggenheims, as if duration could purchase legitimacy. Hazel followed 2 years later, another careful match, another wedding where Peggy stood in an unflattering bridesmaid dress watching her sister promise herself to a man she barely seemed to know. Both marriages were celebrated as successes. Both sisters moved into homes their husbands' families had selected. Both began producing children at appropriate intervals. Neither appeared particularly happy, but happiness was not the metric by which anyone measured these arrangements. Peggy understood that the same future was being prepared for her, except her prospects were narrower. She was not pretty. She had no particular social grace. She read too much and talked about books in ways that made young men uncomfortable. At parties, she stood near walls, watching her peers perform the elaborate ritual of courtship, the careful flirtation, the strategic proximity, the performance of interest in tedious conversations about subjects no one actually cared about. She was now aware of her body in ways that brought no pleasure. Her nose, which she had always known was too large, seemed to grow more prominent as she aged. Her frame remained thin, angular, unfeminine by the standards of the era. She had menstruated late and irregularly, another failure in a long catalog of physical inadequacies. When she looked in mirrors, she saw someone who would need to compensate for her appearance with other assets, which meant primarily the money she would inherit. The amount was specific now. Benjamin's estate had been settled, and Peggy learned she would receive approximately $450,000 when she turned 21. Peggy, roughly $13 million in later valuations, though such conversions meant little. What mattered was that it was enough to make her marriageable despite her appearance, but not enough to make her particularly desirable. She was not an heiress in the sense that could overcome all deficits. She was a girl with money who would need to accept whoever was willing to accept her. Florette rarely spoke to her directly about this, but the message pervaded their interactions. Every criticism of Peggy's posture or speech or clothing contained an implicit reminder that she had limited advantages and could not afford to waste them. When Peggy expressed interest in attending college, her mother dismissed it immediately. Education was unnecessary for women whose function was matrimonial. Worse, it might make her even less appealing to potential husbands who preferred wives without competing intellectual interests. The apartment became a kind of prison. Florette controlled Peggy's movements, her associations, her access to the world beyond their immediate social circle. She could attend certain parties, always chaperoned. She could visit her sisters, though these visits only reinforced what was expected of her. She could not travel alone, could not make decisions about her own time, could not exist outside the narrow parameters her mother had established. In 1918, as the war in Europe entered its final year and influenza began killing Americans in numbers that dwarfed the battlefield casualties, Peggy turned 20. She had never been kissed. She had never had a serious suitor. She had attended dozens of social events designed to facilitate courtship and had been approached by no one except opportunists whose interest in her money was so transparent that even Florette discouraged them. She began experiencing what she would later understand as depression, though in 1918 such conditions were not discussed in families like hers. She slept poorly, woke late, moved through days without purpose or pleasure. Food lost its taste. Conversations felt exhausting. She developed headaches that lasted for days, retreated to her dark bedroom, lay still hoping they would pass. Florette interpreted this as laziness and responded with increased criticism, as if the proper amount of discipline could restore Peggy to a more useful state. The one escape was reading, and even this became complicated. Peggy consumed novels voraciously, Hardy, Balzac, Flaubert, stories about women trapped by circumstance, destroyed by passion, punished for wanting anything beyond what society prescribed for them. She recognized herself in these narratives, but found no comfort in the recognition. The tragic heroines were at least beautiful, at least desired, at least important enough to destroy. She was simply unwanted, which was not tragic, but merely pathetic. Her Uncle Solomon had begun building his museum, the project that would eventually become the Guggenheim Foundation. He occasionally invited family members to review architectural plans, discuss his vision for non-objective art, explain how the building would spiral upward in ways that defied conventional museum design. Peggy attended one of these presentations, watched her uncle describe beauty and permanence and legacy, the way money could be transformed into something that outlasted its owner. She said nothing during the presentation, but afterward, alone, she felt something shift. Her uncle was attempting to purchase immortality through art patronage, to convert Guggenheim copper money into cultural legitimacy. It was perhaps delusional, perhaps doomed, but it represented a use for wealth beyond marriage and reproduction, and the endless performance of social position. The thought did not comfort her exactly, but it suggested a possibility she had not previously considered, that there might be ways to matter that did not depend on being wanted by a husband, that money could be deployed toward purposes other than securing a place in the social structure that had already rejected her. She was still trapped in her mother's apartment, still subject to Florette's control, still facing the probability of either an unsatisfying marriage or permanent spinsterhood. But the idea had been planted, dormant but present, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to grow. Peggy turned 21 on August 26, 1919, and received access to her inheritance. The money arrived in the form of trust distributions managed by advisors her uncles had selected, men who explained that she would receive regular payments but could not touch the principal without approval. Even her financial independence was supervised. Still, the income was substantial, enough to live well, to make decisions Florette could not prevent, to leave. She began planning her escape with the methodical care of someone who understood she would have one chance. She told her mother she wanted to travel, to see Europe now that the war had ended, to visit the museums and galleries that educated young women were expected to appreciate. Florette opposed this immediately, but Peggy had acquired allies. Her sisters, now safely married, supported the idea. Certain family friends suggested that travel might improve her marriage prospects, that European exposure might provide the sophistication that could compensate for her other deficiencies. In December 1920, Peggy sailed for Europe accompanied by a wealthy older woman hired as chaperone, an arrangement that satisfied Florette's sense of propriety while giving Peggy effective freedom. The chaperone, a widow with her own reasons for leaving New York, proved indifferent to Peggy's movements. They arrived in Paris in January 1921, took rooms in a modest hotel in the 6th arrondissement, and within a week, the pretense of supervision had collapsed entirely. Paris was recovering from war, but not yet recovered. The city was filled with Americans, many of them young, many of them fleeing the same constrained futures Peggy had escaped. They gathered in cafes in Montparnasse, talked about art and literature and revolution, drank wine at prices that made excess easy, and performed a version of bohemian life that required substantial money to maintain while pretending money didn't matter. Peggy found them immediately, or they found her. It became clear within days that she represented something valuable to this community: funding. She had an income, an apartment she rented in a better building than most of them could afford, a willingness to pay for dinners and drinks, and small loans that were never repaid. In exchange, they allowed her proximity to their conversations, their parties, their atmosphere of intellectual and sexual freedom. She met Lawrence Vail in the spring of 1921 at a party in Montparnasse. He was 27, American by birth but raised in France, handsome in the specific way that appealed to women who wanted to imagine themselves in romantic narratives. He wrote, though he had published little. He painted occasionally. He talked brilliantly about art and anarchism and the death of bourgeois values, and he talked constantly, as if silence represented a failure of personality. He was also violent. Peggy learned this within weeks of meeting him, but she learned it gradually, in escalating incidents that she initially interpreted as passion. He threw a glass during an argument at a cafe. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks when she said something he found stupid. He pushed her during a party, and when she fell, he told everyone she was drunk. The people around them laughed or looked away or found reasons to be elsewhere. She married him anyway. The wedding took place in March 1922, a small civil ceremony that Peggy described in a letter to her mother with forced enthusiasm. Florette responded with a telegram expressing disappointment, not with the marriage itself, but with the manner of it, the lack of proper ceremony, the absence of family. Peggy had escaped New York only to recreate its dynamics in miniature. She had married a man who needed her money and resented her for having it. Their first apartment was in Montparnasse, paid for with Peggy's income. Lawrence filled it with his friends, painters and writers who arrived at odd hours, drank the wine Peggy purchased, ate the food she provided, and treated her with the casual contempt that bohemian men reserve for women whose money supported their refusal to work. They talked about art as revolution, while Peggy cleaned up their cigarette ash and empty bottles. She became pregnant in late 1922. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning, marked by nausea that lasted months and a persistent anxiety she could not name. Lawrence responded to her condition with irritation, as if her physical discomfort represented a personal imposition. He stayed out later, drank more, came home in states that ranged from coldly silent to explosively angry. Their son was born in March 1923. They named him Sinbad, a choice that Lawrence insisted upon and that Peggy accepted with the same passive surrender she had applied to most of their marriage. The name was ridiculous, theatrical, the kind of thing people chose when they wanted their children to be interesting rather than happy. The baby was small, cried frequently, and required care that Peggy had no training to provide. She hired a nurse immediately, a French woman who took over most of the actual child care while Peggy recovered. This was standard practice among wealthy women, but it created a distance between mother and child that never closed. Sinbad would grow up raised by hired staff, moved between apartments and countries as his parents' chaotic marriage required, never quite belonging to anyone. The violence got worse after the baby arrived. Lawrence resented the attention Peggy gave to their son, resented the nurse's presence, resented the apartment's transformation from bohemian salon to domestic space. He broke furniture during arguments. He threw books, plates, whatever was nearest when rage overtook him. Twice he hit Peggy directly, once hard enough that she locked herself in the bedroom until morning. She did not leave. This fact would perplex her later when she tried to explain those years to people who had not lived them. But in 1923, she had nowhere to go that would not represent failure. Returning to New York meant admitting to her mother that she had been right, that Peggy's attempt at independence had ended in exactly the kind of disaster Florette had predicted. Staying in Paris meant money continued flowing from her trust, meant maintaining the illusion of artistic sophistication, meant she could tell herself she was choosing this life rather than being trapped in it. She began having affairs, or what she called affairs. They were mostly brief encounters with men who moved through their social circle, artists and writers who were willing to sleep with her and then disappear back into their own lives. The sex was often unsatisfying, sometimes unpleasant, but it represented a form of agency, a way of asserting that she could make choices, even if the choices available to her were limited and self-destructive. Lawrence had affairs too, openly, with women he brought to parties and sometimes to their apartment. The marriage had become a performance of liberation, two people destroying each other while calling it freedom. Peggy became pregnant again in the fall of 1924. She had not wanted another child, but contraception was unreliable, and her marriage offered no abstinence. The pregnancy proceeded with the same physical misery as the first, though this time without the naive hope that a baby might stabilize something. She knew better now. Her daughter was born in May 1925. They named her Peggy, a diminutive that suggested affection Peggy did not quite feel. The baby was smaller than Sinbad had been, quieter, a child who seemed to understand from the beginning that she had arrived into chaos and should make herself unobtrusive. Lawrence showed even less interest in this second child. He had wanted sons, plural, heirs to carry forward his vision of artistic aristocracy. A daughter represented nothing to him except evidence of Peggy's biological function. He was gone more often now, traveling to the south of France with artists who needed funding, disappearing for weeks at a time. When he returned, he brought bills for Peggy to pay and stories about people she did not know. The apartment in Montparnasse had become too small for two children and the staff required to manage them, so Peggy rented a larger place near the Luxembourg Gardens. She furnished it with pieces bought from dealers who recognized her as wealthy and inexperienced, sold her items at prices that reflected both qualities. The apartment was meant to suggest bohemian sophistication, rough wooden furniture, primitive art objects, none of the ornate excess that characterized her mother's taste, but it achieved only a different kind of emptiness. Sinbad was 3 years old, already displaying characteristics that worried her. He was withdrawn, prone to sudden rages that seemed learned rather than innate. He watched his parents fight with the same careful attention other children gave to toys. When Lawrence threw things, Sinbad would go rigid and silent. When the noise stopped, he would resume whatever he had been doing, as if violence were simply weather, something that passed through without requiring response. Peggy tried to protect him from the worst scenes, but protection required foresight she did not have. Arguments erupted without warning over trivial provocations. Peggy's tone, her choice of restaurant, her failure to understand a point Lawrence was making about Dadaism or some other movement she was supposed to care about. He would escalate from annoyance to fury in seconds, and by the time she understood what was happening, Sinbad was already there, watching. The nurse Peggy had hired for Peggy was a German woman named Doris, older than the previous staff, more willing to speak plainly about what she observed. She told Peggy that the children needed stability, that moving them between apartments and exposing them to their parents' fights would damage them in ways that would take years to manifest. Peggy listened, agreed, did nothing. Leaving Lawrence meant returning to New York or living alone in Paris as a divorced woman with 2 children. Both options felt impossible. She began spending money more recklessly, as if consumption could substitute for decision-making. She bought paintings from young artists who needed cash immediately, pieces that dealers assured her would appreciate in value, but that she hung without particular care for how they looked together. She purchased furniture and clothing and jewelry, items that arrived and were placed in the apartment without altering the fundamental atmosphere of disorder. Her uncles in New York heard about her spending through the trust administrators. They sent letters expressing concern about her financial management, suggesting she consult with advisors before making major purchases. The letters were polite, but contained an unmistakable message. She was behaving like someone who did not understand the responsibility that came with money, like a child playing at adulthood. She responded with assurances she had no intention of keeping, and the money continued to flow. The trust was structured to provide income regardless of her behavior, a safety mechanism that ensured she could not completely destroy herself financially, even as she tried. In 1926, Lawrence's violence reached a threshold that could not be ignored. They were at a party in Saint-Germain, one of the endless gatherings of expatriate artists drinking wine someone else had purchased. Peggy said something, later she could not remember what, that Lawrence interpreted as criticism. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her out of the apartment into the hallway. She screamed. He slapped her hard enough that she tasted blood. Other guests pulled him off, but their intervention felt perfunctory, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. No one suggested she leave him. The men at the party looked embarrassed. The women offered quiet sympathy that evaporated by the next gathering. Within a week, she and Lawrence were at another party, and the incident had been absorbed into the general atmosphere of bohemian excess, another story about artistic temperament. But something had shifted in Peggy. Not resolve exactly, but a recognition that the marriage would not improve, that Lawrence's violence would continue until it escalated into something worse, and that her children were learning patterns that would shape their entire lives. Sinbad had started hitting the nurse when he was frustrated. Peggy cried constantly, a thin wailing that seemed less like infant distress and more like a response to the emotional climate surrounding her. Peggy began making inquiries about separation, careful questions posed to lawyers and to women in her circle who had navigated divorce. The answers were discouraging. French divorce law was complex, punitive toward women, structured to preserve marriages even when they had become toxic. If she divorced Lawrence, she would likely lose custody of the children or be forced to share it in ways that kept her bound to him permanently. She decided instead on a separation that was practical rather than legal. She rented a house in the countryside outside Paris, a place where she could take the children during the worst periods, where Lawrence could visit but not dominate. The house was old, drafty, surrounded by land she had no interest in cultivating. She hired more staff, a cook, a gardener, additional care for the children, and moved into a rhythm of managed distance from her husband. Lawrence accepted this arrangement because it freed him to pursue his affairs more openly, and because Peggy continued paying his bills. He kept the Montparnasse apartment, filled it with whatever woman he was currently involved with, and visited the country house when he needed money or wanted to assert authority over children he otherwise ignored. In 1927, Peggy met Marcel Duchamp at a gallery opening in the 8th arrondissement. He was 40 years old, already semi-legendary among the avant-garde for having submitted a urinal to an art exhibition and for abandoning painting to play chess. He moved through the gallery with the detachment of someone observing a performance he had written, but no longer found interesting. Peggy approached him because she had been told she should, because knowing Duchamp provided social currency in the circles she wanted to inhabit. She expected condescension. She had learned to expect it from artists who recognized her as money rather than person. Instead, he looked at her with curiosity, asked what she thought of the paintings on display, and listened to her stumbling response without correcting her obvious ignorance. They began meeting regularly, though not romantically. Duchamp had no apparent interest in her sexually, which paradoxically made her trust him more than the men who did. He took her to galleries she would never have found alone, introduced her to dealers and artists, explained modernism in language that assumed intelligence rather than pandering to her lack of education. He taught her how to look at paintings, how to distinguish genuine innovation from fashionable repetition, how to recognize when artists were producing work for markets rather than conviction. Under his guidance, she started buying with more intention, not the random accumulation she had practiced before, but focused acquisitions of contemporary art. Surrealists primarily, painters and sculptors working in modes that challenged conventional representation. She purchased pieces by Ernst, Tanguy, Magritte, artists whose work disturbed her in ways she could not articulate, but that felt important. The purchases were still funded by her trust income, still required approval from administrators in New York who questioned why she was spending thousands on paintings they considered incomprehensible. She learned to justify her acquisitions in language that suggested investment rather than passion, to frame art collecting as wealth preservation rather than aesthetic obsession. The administrators accepted this reasoning because it allowed them to approve her spending without confronting their own conservatism. By 1928, she had accumulated enough pieces to require proper storage. She rented additional space in Paris, began cataloging what she owned, started thinking of herself as a collector rather than simply someone who bought things. The identity provided structure that her marriage lacked, a narrative about her life that did not revolve around Lawrence's violence or her failure as a mother. Her relationship with her children remained distant, mediated by staff. Sinbad was 5 now, already exhibiting the emotional instability that would define his adulthood. He had his father's temper without the charisma that made others tolerate it. He threw tantrums that lasted hours, destroyed his toys systematically, bit the nurses Peggy hired to care for him. She responded by hiring more experienced staff and spending less time with him directly. Peggy was quieter, easier, a child who seemed to understand that making demands would be futile. She played alone, talked to herself in the invented languages children create when adults are unavailable, and watched her mother with an expression Peggy found unbearable. Not accusation exactly, but a kind of resigned assessment, as if Peggy were already calculating what she could expect and had concluded the answer was very little. Lawrence continued his pattern of absence and violent return. He would disappear for months to the south of France or to Berlin, where artistic movements were fragmenting into political extremism, and then arrive back in Paris demanding attention and money. During one of these returns in early 1929, he beat Peggy badly enough that she required a doctor. The physician, accustomed to treating wealthy women who walked into doors, asked no questions and charged accordingly. This time, Peggy insisted on formal separation. Not divorce, that remained too complicated, but a legal arrangement that would limit Lawrence's access to her finances and establish clear custody terms for the children. Lawrence agreed because he had found someone else to support him, a woman with family money who found his rages romantic rather than terrifying. The separation agreement was signed in May 1929. Peggy kept both children. Lawrence retained visitation rights he rarely exercised. The financial settlement gave him a small annual payment from Peggy's income, enough to maintain the fiction that he was not completely dependent on women, but not enough to live well without finding additional sources. With the marriage functionally ended, Peggy accelerated her collecting. She began hosting salons in her Paris apartment, gatherings where artists and writers and dealers came to see her acquisitions and to be seen among them. The events had the same performative quality as the bohemian parties she had attended earlier, but now she was the host rather than the hanger-on, the person whose money made the gathering possible and whose taste determined who was invited. She was not a particularly gracious host. She lacked the social fluency that made such events feel effortless. She often said the wrong thing, asked obvious questions, revealed gaps in her knowledge that more sophisticated collectors would have concealed. But she had money, and she was willing to spend it on living artists, which made her valuable enough that people tolerated her awkwardness. Through these gatherings, she met more artists, more dealers, more people who understood that she represented opportunity. They befriended her instrumentally, the way people befriend anyone with resources they need. She understood this, but understanding did not protect her from feeling grateful for their attention. In October 1929, the stock market crashed in New York. The initial reports suggested a correction, a temporary disruption that would resolve itself through normal market mechanisms. Then the disruption deepened. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated. Men who had considered themselves secure discovered that security had been an illusion built on speculation and debt. The Guggenheim fortune was diversified beyond stocks, rooted in physical assets, mines, smelters, real estate that could not disappear overnight. But the crash's psychological impact was immediate. Peggy's trust income did not stop, but her uncles in New York began sending sharper letters about her expenditures, suggesting that economic conditions required more conservative financial management. She ignored them. The crash made art cheaper. Desperate artists sold pieces at fractions of their previous prices. Dealers who had been condescending now called Peggy directly, offering works they could not otherwise move. She bought aggressively, taking advantage of others' financial catastrophe to expand her collection at bargain rates. This was not generosity. She was not rescuing struggling artists. She was purchasing their work at depressed prices because she had money when they did not, because the mechanism that protected her wealth, trusts, diversification, the physical reality of copper extraction, insulated her from the collapse destroying others. She would later describe this period as educational, as the years when she learned to see art clearly and to build a collection of genuine significance. She would not mention that her education was subsidized by other people's ruin. By 1937, Peggy had been living in Europe for 17 years, long enough that returning to New York felt like visiting a place she had never actually lived. Her children were in boarding schools, Sinbad in Switzerland, Peggy in England, institutions where staff managed the difficulties Peggy could not. She visited them during holidays, brief encounters that satisfied neither party. Sinbad, now 14, had grown sullen and hostile, answered her questions with single syllables, and made clear that he blamed her for everything wrong with his life. Peggy, 12, was quieter, more accommodating, but her accommodation felt like withdrawal rather than affection. With the children contained elsewhere, Peggy focused entirely on art. Her collection had grown substantial, though it remained scattered across storage facilities and apartments in Paris and London. She had been moving between the two cities since her separation from Lawrence, never settling, always occupying temporary spaces that required no commitment. The rootlessness suited her. It meant she could leave when things became complicated, which they inevitably did. In London, she met Peggy Waldman, a woman involved in the city's contemporary art scene, who suggested that Peggy should open a gallery. Not simply collect art, but exhibit it, promote artists, participate actively in shaping public taste rather than passively accumulating objects. The idea appealed to Peggy's need for purpose and her desire to be recognized as something more than a wealthy woman who bought paintings. She rented space at 30 Cork Street in Mayfair, a location that signaled seriousness without the prohibitive costs of Bond Street. The gallery opened in January 1938 under the name Guggenheim Jeune, jeune being French for young, a designation that at 40 years old she had no legitimate claim to, but that sounded better than Guggenheim old or Guggenheim divorced. The opening exhibition featured work by Jean Cocteau, drawings and paintings that attracted modest attention from London's art establishment. Critics noted the gallery's existence, catalogued what was on display, and withheld judgment on whether this new venture represented genuine contribution or dilettantism funded by American money. Peggy read the reviews obsessively, searching for validation that never quite arrived in the terms she wanted. She hired staff, a gallery manager, assistants who understood the practical operations she did not, but insisted on controlling the exhibition program herself. This created immediate problems. She had taste, or at least strong opinions, but she lacked the systematic knowledge that professional curators possessed. She made decisions based on enthusiasm rather than coherent artistic vision, selecting artists because she found them interesting, or because someone she trusted had recommended them, without considering how the exhibitions would build the gallery's reputation. Her second show featured Wassily Kandinsky, an established figure whose work carried automatic prestige. The exhibition was well attended, reviewed positively, and sold poorly. London collectors in 1938 were not buying abstract art from Russian émigrés. They were watching Europe slide toward war and converting assets into forms that could be moved or hidden, not acquiring paintings that would be difficult to transport or explain. Peggy persisted. She mounted exhibitions of contemporary sculpture, of young British artists, of surrealists whose work shocked viewers accustomed to conventional representation. Each show generated attention, sometimes positive, often confused, occasionally hostile. Gallery visitors came to be disturbed or amused, not to purchase. The few sales she made barely covered operating costs, and even those costs were subsidized entirely by her trust income. Her personal life remained chaotic. She had affairs with several of the artists she exhibited, brief entanglements that began with her admiration for their work and ended when they needed money she was no longer willing to provide or when they found someone else. The pattern was consistent. Initial passion, her willingness to support them financially, their gradual recognition that she wanted emotional connection they could not or would not give, dissolution into resentment on both sides. One of these affairs, with a writer named Edwin Muir, lasted longer than the others, several months rather than weeks, and ended more painfully. Muir was married, which Peggy knew but chose to ignore, operating under the logic that bohemian circles did not enforce bourgeois sexual morality. His wife disagreed. When she learned about the affair, she appeared at the gallery and confronted Peggy publicly, screaming accusations that customers and staff witnessed. Peggy stood silent through the encounter, humiliated not by the affair itself, but by her inability to respond, to defend her position, to claim any moral ground. The incident circulated through London's art world as gossip. People who had been polite to her face began declining invitations to gallery events. Critics who had given her shows measured praise started questioning whether Guggenheim June served any purpose beyond providing its owner with social access to artists. The suggestion that her gallery was essentially a mechanism for facilitating her romantic pursuits was not entirely wrong, which made it impossible to refute. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Peggy had friends in Vienna, artists and intellectuals who had assumed that their prominence would protect them from political violence. Some escaped immediately. Others waited, believing that the situation would stabilize, that educated people who had contributed to culture would not be targeted. They were wrong. Letters began arriving in London describing confiscations, arrests, disappearances. People Peggy had met at parties whose work she had admired were gone, imprisoned, fled, dead. She responded by mounting an exhibition of works by artists the Nazi regime had labeled degenerate, paintings and sculptures by Jewish artists and political radicals, pieces that could no longer be shown in Germany or Austria. The exhibition was her attempt at political statement, at using the gallery for something beyond her personal obsessions. It attracted significant attention, drew crowds of people who came to see art that was being destroyed elsewhere in Europe. But the exhibition also revealed her limitations. She curated it with noble intentions and no systematic understanding of what she was doing. She mixed major works by important artists with minor pieces by unknowns, presented them without adequate context, and wrote wall text that displayed her enthusiasm but not her expertise. Critics praised her courage while noting that the exhibition felt more like a gesture than a coherent argument. Sales were minimal. London collectors were not buying art by artists whose home countries were collapsing into fascism. The few pieces that sold went to other émigrés, people who understood what was being lost and wanted to preserve fragments of it. Peggy lost money on the exhibition, as she did on most of her shows, and the financial drain began to concern even her. By the end of 1938, Guggenheim Jeune had been open less than a year and had established itself as interesting but unsustainable. A gallery whose existence depended entirely on one woman's wealth and whose continuation depended on whether she would tire of subsidizing it. In September 1938, Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement, ceding portions of Czechoslovakia to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise that this would be his final territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." Peggy heard the phrase and believed none of it. She had watched Germany expand for 5 years, had seen Austria absorbed, had read letters from friends describing what happened to people deemed undesirable. Peace was not coming. What was coming would make everything else worse. She decided to open a museum, not a gallery that sold work to collectors who did not exist, but a permanent institution that would preserve modern art regardless of what happened to the world around it. The idea was grandiose, probably delusional, and typical of how she responded to fear, by spending money on a project too large to succeed. She consulted with Herbert Read, a British art critic who had advised her on some of her exhibitions. Read took her seriously in ways that surprised her. He suggested she could build a collection of genuine historical importance if she moved quickly and focused on artists whose work would define the era. He provided lists of names, painters, and sculptors she should acquire, pieces that would form the foundation of a proper museum. Peggy studied his lists, made plans, calculated costs. She had money, but not infinite money. Her trust income was substantial, but fixed. If she wanted to build a collection of the scale Read was describing, she would need to buy aggressively and cheaply, which meant buying from people who were desperate. Europe in 1939 provided endless desperation. Artists were fleeing Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Many of them were Jewish, all of them were poor, and what they could carry was limited. Paintings were portable wealth, but only if someone would buy them. Peggy positioned herself as that buyer. She later claimed she was rescuing art from destruction, preserving cultural heritage that fascism wanted to erase. This was true in the sense that the art she bought might otherwise have been destroyed. It was also true that she was exploiting people who had no alternative, purchasing work at prices that reflected their terror rather than the art's value. She bought from André Breton, who needed money to escape France. She bought from Max Ernst, who needed money to survive in France. She bought from dealers who were liquidating their inventory before fleeing, from collectors who were converting paintings into cash and exit visas. Every transaction was voluntary in the technical sense and coercive in every other sense. She had options. The sellers did not. Her methodology was systematic. She visited studios and galleries daily, inspected work quickly, made immediate offers that were take it or leave it. The offers were fair by the standards of a collapsing market, which meant they were grotesquely unfair by any other standard. A painting worth thousands sold for hundreds. Sculptures that had taken months to create were purchased for amounts that covered a week's rent. Some artists refused her. They told her directly that her prices were insulting, that she was profiteering from catastrophe. She did not argue. She simply moved to the next artist, the next dealer, the next desperate person who would accept her terms because refusal meant having nothing. By the summer of 1939, she had acquired dozens of major works, breaks, Leger, Miros, pieces that would eventually form the core of her collection. She stored them in a warehouse in Paris, hired staff to catalog and crate them, made plans for transporting them to London once her museum was ready. The museum itself was becoming concrete. She had found a location, a building in London that could be converted into exhibition space. Architects were drawing plans. Herbert Reed was helping her develop the permanent collection structure, identifying gaps that needed filling, artists she had not yet acquired who were essential to her vision. Then in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The museum plans stopped immediately. The building she had intended to convert was requisitioned for government use. The architects disappeared into military service or government contracts. The war that everyone had been pretending to prevent had arrived, and it made her museum project instantly irrelevant. Peggy panicked. She had a warehouse in Paris filled with paintings and sculptures worth, at least by her accounting, substantial amounts. If Germany invaded France, the collection would be seized or destroyed. The Nazis were confiscating art systematically, keeping pieces they found acceptable for German museums, and destroying everything else as degenerate. Her collection was entirely degenerate by their standards. She needed to move it out of France immediately. But moving art during wartime required permissions, export licenses, transportation that was being redirected to military purposes. She spent weeks navigating bureaucracy, bribing officials, calling in favors from people she barely knew. Eventually, she arranged for the collection to be shipped to a chateau outside Paris owned by a friend, a temporary solution that moved the art away from the city, but kept it in France. Her children were still in their boarding schools. Sinbad was 16 now, Peggy 14. She visited them in early 1940, found them both withdrawn and hostile in different ways. Sinbad was openly contemptuous of her, angry that she cared more about paintings than her family. Peggy said little, answered questions without volunteering information, made it clear through silence that she expected nothing from her mother and was not disappointed by receiving nothing. Peggy tried to explain that she was protecting important work, that preserving art mattered, that what she was doing would have significance beyond their private family troubles. Neither child was convinced. They saw her clearly, a woman who had abandoned them to staff and institutions, while she pursued obsessions that made sense only to herself. She left the schools feeling the same inadequacy she had felt her entire life, the sense that she was failing at fundamental tasks other people managed without effort. But instead of changing her behavior, she returned to Paris and continued buying art. It was what she knew how to do, the only arena where her money translated into something that felt like accomplishment. By May 1940, Germany had invaded France. The war everyone knew was coming had arrived in earnest. Peggy was in Paris when the invasion began, still buying paintings as the German army advanced toward the city. She purchased a Brancusi sculpture literally days before the Wehrmacht entered Paris, negotiating price while refugees streamed past the gallery windows. She would later describe this period as the most productive of her collecting career, as if productivity were the appropriate metric for behavior during an invasion. The German army entered Paris on June 14, 1940. Peggy was still in the city, watching from her apartment window as soldiers marched down boulevards emptied of everyone except those who had nowhere else to go. She had waited too long. The rational moment to leave had passed weeks earlier, but rationality had never governed her decisions. She had stayed because the art dealers were still selling, because she could still acquire pieces at prices that would never be available again, because leaving meant admitting that her collecting project was less important than her survival. Her collection was scattered across multiple locations: the chateau outside Paris, a warehouse in the city, her apartment. Some pieces were properly crated, others wrapped in blankets, a few still hanging on walls as if this were normal life rather than occupation. She needed to consolidate everything and move it out of France, but moving anything required trucks, drivers, fuel, and permissions from authorities who were now German. She had one advantage. She was American. The United States was not yet in the war, and American citizens could still claim neutral status, could still travel with less restriction than Europeans. But this status was temporary and conditional. If she waited too long, or if America entered the war, her passport would protect nothing. She hired a truck through a dealer who knew someone who knew someone. The price was extravagant, paid in cash that Peggy withdrew from banks that were still operating, but might not be tomorrow. The driver was a Frenchman who had no interest in art, but understood that desperate people paid well. They loaded paintings and sculptures into the truck over 2 days, working carefully not to attract attention from soldiers who were occupying the city's administrative buildings, but had not yet established systematic control. Some pieces could not fit. A large Calder mobile, several sculptures, paintings too fragile to transport without proper crating materials that were no longer available. Peggy made decisions in minutes about what to take and what to leave behind, decisions that would have taken weeks in ordinary circumstances. She chose based on size, portability, and her assessment of what was most valuable, though her assessments were intuitive rather than systematic. The truck left Paris heading south toward the Spanish border. Peggy followed in a car with her driver and 2 servants she had convinced to come with her. Her children were in England. She had confirmed by telegram that their schools were still operating, that they were safe for whatever safety meant in 1940. She did not try to reach them. The route north was cut off, and England itself might be invaded next. All she could do was move in the direction that seemed least immediately dangerous. The roads were packed with refugees, families with suitcases, farmers with livestock, old women carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. The car moved slowly, sometimes stopping for hours behind columns of people walking because they had no vehicles. Peggy watched them from the car window, saw mothers carrying children who were too tired to walk, saw men pulling carts loaded with possessions they would eventually abandon when the carts became too heavy to pull further. She felt nothing about this, or told herself she felt nothing. What she felt was impatience at the delay, frustration that the roads were blocked, anxiety about whether the truck carrying her collection was making better progress. The people on the road were suffering in ways she could see but not access emotionally. They existed in a different category of experience from her own. The truck reached the Spanish border first. She received a telegram at a hotel in Biarritz confirming that it had crossed into Spain, that the art was safe. She followed 2 days later with her smaller entourage, crossing at a checkpoint where border guards were overwhelmed by the volume of people trying to enter. Her American passport moved her through faster than the French and Belgian refugees who had been waiting for days. Spain was neutral, aligned with fascism but not actively fighting. Peggy stayed in Madrid briefly, made arrangements for the collection to be shipped to Lisbon, where boats still departed for America. She paid for this in multiple currencies, bribed officials who could expedite paperwork, and called contacts in New York to arrange for receiving the shipment once it arrived. In Madrid, she met Max Ernst again. She had bought his work in Paris, had known him peripherally in the years before the war. Now he was trapped in Spain, trying to reach America, but lacking the visa required for entry. The American consulate was processing hundreds of applications daily and rejecting most of them. Artists with no money, no sponsors, and no immediate family in America were low priority. Peggy offered to help him. This was not purely altruistic. Ernst was talented, increasingly recognized as an important surrealist, and if she could claim credit for rescuing him, it would enhance her reputation as a patron. She contacted her uncles in New York, asked them to intervene with immigration authorities to provide financial guarantees that would satisfy the requirement that immigrants not become public charges. Her uncles agreed, reluctantly. They viewed her art collecting with skepticism, considered her investments in modern art frivolous, but they were willing to use family influence to expedite visa applications. Within weeks, Ernst had the paperwork he needed to travel to America. While waiting for the visa to be processed, Peggy and Ernst became involved. The affair began with the same pattern as her previous relationships: her admiration for his work, his gratitude for her assistance, mutual loneliness in a foreign city during wartime. They took a room together in a cheap hotel, spent days waiting for bureaucracy to move while bombs fell on other parts of Europe. The affair was not romantic. Ernst was grateful but not affectionate, willing to sleep with her but not particularly interested in her beyond what she could provide. She understood this but proceeded anyway, operating under the familiar logic that physical intimacy was better than isolation, that being used was better than being invisible. By July 1940, they both had passage booked on a ship leaving Lisbon for New York. The collection had already been loaded onto a different ship that had departed weeks earlier. Peggy carried almost nothing with her: some clothes, important documents, jewelry she had not sold. Everything else had been abandoned in Paris or was somewhere in transit, moving through channels she could not track, carried by people she would never see again. The ship departed Lisbon on a calm morning. Peggy stood on deck watching the coastline disappear, understanding that she was returning to New York after 20 years of exile, returning not in triumph, but in retreat. The ship arrived in New York Harbor in August 1940. Peggy stood at the railing, watching the city emerge from morning fog, the skyline higher and denser than she remembered, buildings erected during her absence that marked time passing in ways she had tried to ignore. She was 42 years old, returning to a place she had fled specifically to avoid becoming the person she had become anyway. Her family met her at the dock, not warmly. Her uncles had arranged Ernst's visa as a favor, but favors created obligations, and they made clear through polite coldness that she had accumulated too many. Her mother, Florette, was 70, still living in the same dark apartment on Park Avenue, still maintaining the posture of disappointed refinement that had defined Peggy's childhood. The reunion was brief, formal, marked by observations about Peggy's appearance and questions about the children that carried implicit criticism. Peggy had rented an apartment on East 51st Street, a place with enough room for her to live and eventually to display portions of her collection once it arrived. The collection was her justification for everything, the reason she had stayed in Europe during the invasion, the reason she had spent her inheritance on objects instead of security, the reason she could claim her time abroad had been purposeful rather than simply chaotic flight from one disaster to another. But the collection did not arrive. Weeks passed, then months. She made inquiries through shipping companies, contacted officials at various ports, and received vague responses about wartime delays and cargo prioritization. Ships were being sunk by German submarines. Convoys were being rerouted. Commercial shipping was subordinated to military needs. Her crates of paintings and sculptures were somewhere in transit, possibly lost, possibly destroyed, possibly sitting in a warehouse she would never identify. Ernst arrived separately, on a later ship. He came to her apartment, thanked her for facilitating his escape, and made clear through his manner that gratitude did not constitute continued obligation. He needed to establish himself in New York, to find gallery representation, to rebuild a career that had been interrupted by war. He needed Peggy's connections, but not her company. She introduced him to people anyway: gallery owners, collectors, critics who could advance his reputation. Some of these introductions were successful. Ernst was talented enough that even skeptical New Yorkers recognized his work as significant. But Peggy's role in promoting him became a subject of gossip in the tight circles of New York's art world. People noted that she was sleeping with an artist she was also sponsoring, that her patronage and her romantic obsessions were impossible to separate, that her money had purchased access to his bed as surely as it purchased access to gallery walls. The affair deteriorated over months. Ernst met other women, younger and more beautiful than Peggy, women who wanted him without needing to claim credit for rescuing him. He began avoiding Peggy's apartment, missed dinners they had planned, stopped pretending that his presence in her life was anything other than transactional. By early 1941, they were no longer involved except in the attenuated sense that she continued helping him professionally, while he withdrew from her personally. Her children arrived from England that spring, evacuated as the Blitz intensified. Sinbad was 17, Pagan 15. They came to New York because there was nowhere else for them to go, not because they wanted to be with their mother. The reunion was strained from the beginning. Sinbad was openly hostile, angry at having been sent to boarding schools, angry at the war, angry at Peggy for reasons he could articulate and reasons he could not. Pegguin was quieter, more withdrawn, a teenager who had learned that expressing needs led nowhere useful. Peggy tried to establish routines with them, family dinners and conversations about their education and their futures. These attempts failed consistently. Sinbad refused to engage, spent evenings out with people Peggy never met, came home drunk or high or not at all. Peggy attended the dinners, but contributed nothing, answered questions in monosyllables, and made clear through every gesture that she was performing a role rather than participating in family life. The apartment became a space where three people lived separately, passing each other in hallways, avoiding the confrontations that might require actual engagement. Peggy hired staff to manage the household, tried to delegate the practical aspects of parenthood to people who were paid to care. It was the same pattern she had established when the children were young, except now they were old enough to understand exactly what she was doing. In October 1941, her collection finally arrived. The crates were delivered to a warehouse in Manhattan, stacked floor to ceiling, some damaged from improper storage and rough handling during transport. She spent days unpacking, cataloging what had survived and what had been destroyed. Several paintings had torn, a sculpture had broken, some pieces had water damage from condensation or leaks, but most of the collection was intact, hundreds of works by dozens of artists, the accumulation of her years in Europe preserved despite everything. She began planning how to display it, how to create the museum she had envisioned in London before the war made that impossible. But New York in 1941 was not interested in avant-garde European art. The city was preparing for war. America had not yet entered, but everyone knew it was coming. Museums were concerned with protecting their permanent collections, not exhibiting challenging new work. Collectors were conservative, purchasing safe investments rather than experimental pieces. The market that might have existed for what Peggy had accumulated had evaporated. She approached gallery owners about mounting exhibitions from her collection. Most declined politely, explaining that there was no audience for surrealism during wartime, that Americans wanted art that affirmed traditional values rather than questioned them. A few agreed to show individual pieces, but only if Peggy covered the exhibition costs, which meant she would be paying to display work she already owned to audiences who did not want to see it. Her uncles heard about her difficulties and offered advice that was really criticism. They had watched her spend her inheritance on art they considered worthless, had facilitated her visa arrangements for artists they viewed as parasites, and had seen nothing come of it except her return to New York, without money, without husband, without purpose, they could recognize as legitimate. They suggested she settle down, remarry if possible, focus on her children, who clearly needed more than she was providing. She ignored them. She had not spent 20 years collecting art to be told by copper magnates that she should abandon it and return to the role of disappointed wealthy woman waiting for remarriage. But their criticism reflected a reality she could not escape. She had built a collection no one wanted to see, had devoted her resources to a project that had no audience, had returned to a city that offered her no place except the one she had fled. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war the next day. Peggy's apartment building instituted blackout protocols, taping windows and covering lights that might guide enemy aircraft. The precautions were performative. No one seriously believed Manhattan would be bombed, but the rituals provided structure to collective anxiety, something to do while waiting to learn what the war would actually require. The war made her museum project possible in ways peace had not. Artists were fleeing Europe in greater numbers now, arriving in New York with nothing except their work and their reputations. Gallery owners who had dismissed European modernism months earlier began reconsidering. If American boys were dying to defend European civilization, perhaps European art deserved more serious attention than it had previously received. Peggy found space for her museum at 30 West 57th Street, a building that had housed other galleries and could be converted into something more ambitious. She hired Frederick Kiesler to design the interior, an architect whose vision aligned with her desire for something theatrical, something that would announce itself as different from conventional museum spaces. Kiesler created an environment that was more installation than gallery. He eliminated traditional walls, instead suspending paintings from ceiling cables so they hung in space without visible support. He designed curved wooden chairs that looked like abstract sculptures, lighting that could be adjusted for each piece, floors painted in different colors to create distinct zones within the open space. The result was beautiful, disorienting, and completely unsuited to actually looking at art. Visitors would spend more time navigating the space than examining the paintings. But that was perhaps the point, to make the experience of viewing art as challenging as the art itself. The museum opened in October 1942 under the name Art of This Century. The opening exhibition combined work from Peggy's collection with pieces by contemporary American artists, an attempt to position European modernism in dialogue with emerging American movements. The gallery was crowded with people who had come to witness spectacle rather than study art, critics who arrived ready to praise or condemn, artists hoping for recognition, and wealthy people who attended openings as social obligation. The reviews were mixed. Some critics praised Peggy's ambition and her willingness to exhibit challenging work that conventional museums ignored. Others noted that the installation overwhelmed the art, that Kiesler's design served his ego more than the paintings, that the whole enterprise felt like a wealthy woman's vanity project dressed up as cultural contribution. Peggy read every review multiple times, searching for validation that never arrived in pure form. Even the positive reviews contained qualifications, compliments that were also criticisms, acknowledgement of her effort combined with skepticism about her judgment. She had opened the museum to prove she was more than a rich collector, but the reviews suggested she had only proven she could afford expensive failures. The museum operated as a hybrid, part gallery, part performance space, part salon. Peggy held openings that turned into parties, invited artists and intellectuals who came as much for the atmosphere as the art, and created a social space where European émigrés and American artists could encounter each other. The encounters were not always productive. European surrealists found American abstract expressionists crude and unsophisticated. Americans found the Europeans pretentious and irrelevant to American conditions. Peggy positioned herself between these factions, trying to broker connections, to facilitate collaborations, to create the sense that art of this century represented something important. But her position was inherently unstable. The Europeans tolerated her because she had money and connections. The Americans needed her because she provided exhibition space. Neither group respected her judgment about art. She was useful, which was not the same as important. Her relationship with Max Ernst had officially ended, but he remained in her orbit, exhibiting at the museum, attending openings, accepting her help, while making clear it came without too affection attached. In 1941, he had married Peggy in a brief ceremony that seemed to benefit primarily him. It provided immigration security, access to her income, and legitimacy in American art circles. The marriage was never romantic, barely even companionable. They maintained separate spaces within her apartment, lived parallel lives, and avoided each other, except when professional circumstances required contact. By 1943, Ernst had fallen in love with someone else, a younger woman named Dorothea Tanning, a painter whose work he admired and whose presence made her claim on his attention impossible for Peggy to ignore. Ernst spent increasing amounts of time in Tanning's studio, stopped pretending that his marriage to Peggy was anything other than legal convenience, and eventually asked for a divorce. Peggy granted it. She had no legal grounds to refuse, no emotional capital to convince him to stay, no illusion that their marriage had ever been real. The divorce was finalized quickly, without drama, another transaction in a relationship that had been transactional from the beginning. Ernst moved out of her apartment and immediately into Tanning's. Peggy told friends the separation was mutual, that the marriage had served its purpose, that she had no regrets. None of this was true. The museum continued operating, mounting exhibitions that generated attention without generating revenue. Peggy covered all costs from her trust income, paying for installations, publications, opening receptions, and the staff required to keep the space functioning. The trust administrators in New York sent increasingly pointed letters about her spending, noting that she was depleting her capital faster than it could regenerate, that she was treating her inheritance as infinite when it was merely large. She ignored the warnings. The museum had become the justification for her entire life, evidence that her years in Europe had not been wasted, that her money had been spent on something meaningful, that she had contributed to culture rather than simply consumed it. If the museum failed, what remained? A failed marriage, estranged children, a collection of art that would be dispersed after her death, absorbed into other collections, or sold to cover debts. Her children were still in New York, still living lives that barely intersected with hers, Sinbad was 19 now, old enough for military service, waiting to be drafted or to enlist. He spent his time drinking with other young men who were doing the same, pretending that bravado could substitute for whatever they would face when the war required them to actually fight. Peggy was 17, finishing school, developing interests in art that seemed to emerge from genuine talent rather than inherited obligation. Peggy tried to engage with Pegin's painting, offered to introduce her to artists who might provide instruction, to include her work in group exhibitions at the museum. Peggy refused. She wanted nothing from her mother, least of all professional advancement that would be attributed to family connection rather than merit. The rejection was quiet, polite, and absolute. In 1943, a painter named Jackson Pollock appeared at Art of this Century carrying a portfolio of work that several people had told Peggy she should see. He was 31, unknown except within narrow circles, poor in ways that made even struggling artists uncomfortable. He wore work clothes to the museum, spoke in fragments when he spoke at all, and seemed perpetually on the edge of either violence or collapse. Peggy looked at his paintings in her office while he stood silently by the door. The work was chaotic, dense with imagery that seemed to emerge from psychological states she recognized. Rage, anxiety, the sense that control was an illusion maintained through effort that could fail at any moment. She did not fully understand what she was seeing, but she recognized something in it that felt important, or at least felt like it might become important if someone with resources decided it should. She offered him a monthly stipend, $150, later increased to $300, in exchange for his work and first option to exhibit it. The arrangement made Pollock effectively her employee, dependent on her continued support, bound to produce paintings she could claim credit for discovering. He accepted because he had no alternative. He was about to be drafted, was drinking heavily enough that mornings were increasingly difficult, and had no gallery representation or income beyond whatever odd jobs he could maintain between benders. Peggy secured a draft deferment for him by claiming his work was culturally significant, that losing him to military service would deprive America of important artistic contribution. The claim was speculative. Pollock had produced nothing that justified the designation, but the draft board accepted it, or perhaps simply moved on to other cases that seemed more worth pursuing. She gave him his first solo exhibition in November 1943. The show featured paintings that were figurative but distorted, images of bodies and animals rendered in ways that suggested internal violence rather than external observation. Critics who attended were divided. Some saw genuine talent, psychological depth that reflected wartime anxiety. Others saw incompetent draftsmanship disguised as expressionism, work that would have been ignored if not for the patronage behind it. The exhibition sold poorly. A few small pieces moved at low prices to collectors who were either gambling on Pollock's future reputation or who genuinely responded to the work. Most paintings remained unsold, were returned to Peggy's storage, added to her accumulating inventory of artists who had not yet found audiences. Pollock's dependence on her increased. The monthly stipend was never enough. He drank through it within days, borrowed against future payments, showed up at the museum asking for advances Peggy usually granted because refusing meant watching him deteriorate more rapidly than he was already deteriorating. She was enabling his alcoholism while funding his painting, unable to separate the two, perhaps unwilling to examine whether the chaos that made his work interesting was the same chaos that would eventually destroy him. Their relationship was not romantic, though rumors suggested otherwise. People who saw them together at openings, who watched Peggy defend his work to skeptical collectors, who observed how much money she poured into promoting an artist with minimal commercial prospects, assumed she was sleeping with him. She was not. Pollock was involved with a woman named Lee Krasner, also a painter, who managed his daily existence with the grim determination of someone who understood that stopping would mean watching him die. What Peggy had with Pollock was something different, a form of possession that was professional rather than sexual, but equally binding. She had discovered him, funded him, given him legitimacy through exhibition. His success, if it came, would validate her judgment. His failure would be her failure too, evidence that she could not distinguish talent from delusion, that her money had purchased attention, but not accuracy. She gave him a second solo show in 1945, mounting a more ambitious exhibition that featured larger paintings, work that was beginning to move away from figuration toward the abstraction that would eventually define his career. The response was slightly better than the first show. More critics attended, more reviews appeared, and while most remained skeptical, a few identified Pollock as potentially significant, someone to watch if he survived his own instability. Sales remained minimal. Peggy bought several paintings herself, paying prices she had set, which meant effectively subsidizing herself. The museum's financial situation was deteriorating. She had been covering operational costs for 3 years, had accumulated debts to printers and installers and staff, had depleted her trust income to the point where administrators were refusing to approve additional expenditures without detailed justifications. Her uncle Solomon had died in 1949, having completed his museum, the building that would eventually bear the Guggenheim name, Frank Lloyd Wright's spiral structure, that would define how the world thought about the family's cultural legacy. Peggy had attended the funeral, stood among relatives who had accomplished things that would last, and understood that her museum was temporary, dependent on her continued funding, destined to close the moment she could no longer sustain it. Sinbad had been drafted in 1944, had served in Europe, and returned in 1945 unchanged, except for an intensified bitterness that now had military service to justify it. He moved into a small apartment Peggy paid for, drank steadily, and occasionally appeared at the museum to borrow money. He showed no interest in art, no curiosity about what his mother was attempting, no connection to her beyond the financial dependence he resented but would not relinquish. Peggy was painting seriously now, creating work that showed genuine skill, but that remained in her mother's shadow. When galleries considered her work, they asked first about her family connections, about whether Peggy would promote her, about whether association with the Guggenheim name would generate publicity. Peggy refused all of it, insisted on being evaluated independently, and was largely ignored as a result. By 1946, Peggy was exhausted. She had run the museum for 4 years, had mounted dozens of exhibitions, had supported numerous artists, and had accomplished what exactly? Pollock was becoming known, but his reputation remained contested, dependent on a small circle of critics who might change their minds. The museum had introduced New York to artists it would not otherwise have seen, but introduction was not acceptance. European surrealism remained exotic, commercially marginal, something that would be absorbed into art history, but that had not transformed American taste the way Peggy had imagined. The question she would not ask directly was whether any of it mattered, whether her money had purchased something beyond her own occupation. The museum gave her purpose, filled her days, provided a role that was not wife or mother or failed daughter. But purpose was not meaning, and the distinction was becoming harder to ignore. In 1947, Peggy closed Art of This Century. She announced it as a temporary closure, suggested she might reopen in a different location, but everyone understood it was permanent. The museum had cost her approximately $40,000 per year to operate, money she no longer had or was no longer willing to spend on a project that had never achieved what she had hoped it would achieve. The collection was packed again, crated and placed in storage, waiting for decisions about its future that Peggy could not yet make. She kept the Pollock paintings, the ones she had purchased and the ones he had given her as payment for the stipend she had provided. They were worth almost nothing in 1947, valued primarily as evidence of her judgment rather than as commercial assets. She stored them carefully anyway, preserving what might become valuable if Pollock survived himself long enough to matter. She decided to return to Europe, not to Paris, which was recovering from occupation, in ways that made it unrecognizable as the city she had left, but to Venice, where she had visited before the war and where property was cheap because the city was sinking and everyone knew it. She found the Palazzo Vigne dei Leoni through a dealer who specialized in selling properties that Italians wanted to unload before they became unsellable. The palazzo was unfinished, had been unfinished for 2 centuries, would remain unfinished forever. Construction had halted at the ground floor in the 18th century for reasons no one could definitively explain. Money had run out, or the architect had died, or the family had lost interest. What remained was a single-story structure on the Grand Canal, surrounded by gardens that had been neglected for decades, walls covered in vines that were strangling the stone beneath. She purchased it for $60,000, less than she had spent on single paintings, less than she had lost running the museum for a year. The price reflected Venice's decline, a city that was beautiful and dying, preserved by tourists who came to see decay dressed as history. The palazzo suited her perfectly. It was incomplete, isolated, beautiful in ways that emphasized its failure to be what it was supposed to be. She shipped her collection to Venice, filling the ground floor with paintings and sculptures that transformed the space into something between museum and residence. There was no proper separation between public and private areas. Her bedroom was adjacent to galleries. Visitors who came to see the art walked past her personal belongings, her unmade bed, her clothing draped over chairs. The arrangement suggested either radical informality or an inability to distinguish between her life and her collection. Her children did not come with her. Sinbad remained in New York, living on money from a small trust Peggy had established for him, seeing a succession of women he treated badly and who left him once they understood that his name and his access to money did not compensate for his rage. Peggy had married an artist named Jean Hélion, a hasty decision that seemed designed primarily to escape her mother's orbit. The marriage would fail within years, but in 1947 it provided Peggy with an identity separate from being Peggy Guggenheim's daughter. Venice accepted Peggy the way it accepted all wealthy foreigners, with polite distance, taking her money while maintaining the superiority that came from living in a city that had been important when America was wilderness. She was invited to events by people who wanted access to her collection, who needed funding for restoration projects, who understood that wealthy eccentrics were part of Venice's economy. She was not invited to homes, not included in the actual social structure, not treated as anything other than a well-funded visitor whose money made her useful, but not belonging. She began opening the palazzo to the public on certain days, charging admission, hiring staff to manage visitors who came to see art they could not see anywhere else in Italy. The Italian government had refused to allow modern art into state museums. The Catholic Church and conservative political forces considered most of her collection degenerate, morally corrupting, unsuitable for public display. Peggy's palazzo became the only place in Venice where people could see Picasso, Kandinsky, Ernst Moreau, the painters who had defined early 20th century modernism. The admission fees barely covered operating costs. She was subsidizing the palazzo the same way she had subsidized the museum, spending her trust income to maintain a project that served primarily to occupy her time. The trust itself was shrinking. Her uncles were dead now, and the administrators managing her inheritance were professional financiers who had no sentimental attachment to her or her projects. They sent quarterly statements showing declining principal, noting that her spending exceeded her investment returns, warning that continuation meant eventual depletion. She ignored the warnings. What was she supposed to do with the money, if not spend it? She had no husband, no real relationship with her children, no purpose except the collection. The palazzo gave her something to manage, a role to perform, a reason to wake up in a city where the days were otherwise indistinguishable. Mornings looking at the canal, afternoons managing staff, evenings alone with her dogs. She acquired more dogs over the years, small breeds that she carried with her everywhere, that slept in her bed and ate from her plates and were treated with more consistent affection than she had given her children. The dogs were replaceable in ways that people were not. When they died, she got new ones, and the grief was manageable because it was predictable, limited, and something she could control through the simple mechanism of purchasing another animal. Her appearance had deteriorated in ways she no longer tried to disguise. She was 50 years old in 1948, looked older, dressed in clothing that suggested indifference to how others saw her. She wore the same few outfits repeatedly, paired expensive jewelry with casual clothes in combinations that looked accidental rather than stylish, stopped dyeing her hair and let it gray in uneven patches. The careful presentation she had maintained in New York, the attempt to compensate for unattractiveness through grooming and fashion, had been abandoned. She began having affairs again, or what could generously be called affairs. Brief encounters with younger men, artists and writers and hangers-on, who understood that sleeping with her occasionally granted access to her money and her connections. The arrangements were transparently transactional, but she participated anyway, operating under the same logic she had always operated under. Temporary intimacy was better than permanent solitude. Being used was better than being invisible. One of these relationships was with Raoul Gregorich, a man 30 years younger than her, good-looking in the empty way that made him suitable for wealthy older women who wanted decoration rather than substance. He moved into the palazzo, occupied her bed when convenient, and treated her with casual contempt that she accepted as the price of his presence. He stole from her, small amounts initially, then larger sums as he realized she either did not notice or did not care enough to confront him. By 1960, Peggy had lived in Venice for more than a decade, long enough that the city had absorbed her into its population of permanent exiles. She was 62 years old, still opening the palazzo to visitors several afternoons each week, still maintaining the collection that had consumed her inheritance, still occupying the incomplete building that would never be finished. The art world had changed in ways that vindicated some of her judgments and exposed others. Jackson Pollock had died in 1956, drunk, driving too fast, crashing his car into a tree on Long Island. His death elevated his reputation immediately, the troubled genius destroyed by the same forces that made his work powerful. The paintings Peggy owned, which had been nearly worthless when she acquired them, were now valuable enough that selling just a few would solve her financial problems permanently. She did not sell them. Partly this was practical. The paintings were her security, the assets that guaranteed she could maintain the palazzo regardless of what happened to her trust income. But it was also emotional. The Pollocks represented her most significant success as a patron, evidence that her judgment had occasionally been accurate, that her money had supported an artist who mattered even if mattering had required his death to be confirmed. Her relationship with her children had calcified into permanent distance. Sinbad was 40 years old, living in Paris, married and divorced, father to children. He was no better at parenting than Peggy had been. He drank steadily, moved between apartments he could not afford, borrowed money from his mother with decreasing pretense that he would repay it. When he visited Venice, which was rarely, he stayed only long enough to confirm that nothing had changed between them, that the resentment he felt was justified by the inadequacy of her affection. Peggy's life had followed a trajectory that seemed designed to replicate her mother's worst patterns. She had divorced Jean Hélion, married another artist, divorced again, continued painting work that showed genuine talent, but that was perpetually overshadowed by association with her mother's name. She lived in Paris with her two sons from different marriages, raising them with slightly more presence than she had received, but not enough to prevent damage that was already visible. Peggy saw her grandchildren occasionally, brief visits where she performed the role of grandmother, without any natural facility for it. She gave them gifts, expensive toys, clothing, things that money could purchase, and received polite thank yous that contained no real warmth. The children understood what their parents understood, that Peggy was someone who existed at a distance, who sent money when asked, who had played almost no meaningful role in the family except as the source of funds and dysfunction. The palazzo had become famous in certain circles. Art historians visited to study the collection. Critics came to write about the only place in Italy where modernism could be seen comprehensively. Tourists who had read about Peggy in guidebooks arrived expecting eccentric glamour and found instead a deteriorating building managed by an increasingly eccentric old woman. She gave tours sometimes, walking visitors through the galleries, telling stories about acquiring pieces that emphasized her proximity to genius while obscuring the transactional nature of most relationships. She hired a young assistant named John Honesbin to help manage the collection and the daily operations of the palazzo. Honesbin was gay, uninterested in her romantically, which made him one of the few men in her life who was useful without being exploitative. He organized the collection properly, created accurate records of what she owned, began the process of cataloging everything in ways that would matter after she died. The cataloging forced her to confront questions about what would happen to the collection. She was 65 in 1963, not dying immediately, but old enough that mortality was no longer abstract. The palazzo was hers, but after her death it would be sold or demolished unless she made arrangements. The collection would be dispersed to settle her debts unless she gave it to an institution that would preserve it. She began negotiating with museums. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, her uncle's institution, the legitimate museum that bore the family name, was the obvious choice. But negotiations stalled repeatedly over questions of control, display conditions, and whether Peggy's collection would be absorbed into the permanent holdings or maintained separately. She wanted her name attached permanently, wanted her choices validated as equal to her uncle's. The museum administrators wanted the art without the obligation. Eventually, she reached an agreement with the Guggenheim Foundation. The collection would remain in Venice during her lifetime, would be managed according to her preferences, but after her death would become property of the foundation, would be preserved and displayed with her name attached. It was a compromise that gave neither party everything they wanted, but that ensured the collection would survive her. The agreement meant accepting that her life's work would eventually be absorbed into an institution she had no control over, that her uncle's legacy would encompass hers, that she would be remembered as a minor Guggenheim who had collected interesting art rather than as someone significant in her own right. But the alternative was worse, watching the collection be auctioned after her death, dispersed to private collectors, absorbed into other museums' holdings where her role would be mentioned in catalog footnotes, if at all. Her health began declining in ways that were not dramatic, but that accumulated into unavoidable awareness of deterioration. She developed arthritis that made walking painful, required a cane she resented using because it marked her as old. Her eyesight worsened, required glasses thick enough that visitors sometimes stared. She had trouble sleeping, would wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark, listening to water lap against the Palazzo's foundation, waiting for dawn without any particular hope that daylight would bring anything worth waking for. She still kept dogs, still carried them through the Palazzo, still talked to them in ways that suggested they understood more than the staff or visitors or family members who passed through her life. When the dogs died, she buried them in the garden, marking their graves more carefully than she had marked most human relationships. In 1967, Peggy died in Paris. The cause was listed as overdose, sleeping pills taken intentionally or accidentally, a distinction that the investigation could not determine, and that perhaps did not matter. She was 42 years old, the same age Peggy had been when returning to New York from Europe, the same age when futures that had seemed open revealed themselves as already determined. Peggy received the news by telegram, the same medium that had informed her of her father's death 55 years earlier. She did not collapse, did not rage, did not perform grief in ways that would have suggested depths of feeling she had never shown, while Peggy was alive. She acknowledged the death factually, made arrangements for the funeral, attended and stood dry-eyed while her daughter was buried, and returned to Venice 2 days later to resume managing the Palazzo. Peggy turned 70 in 1968. The Palazzo had been open to the public for 20 years, had received thousands of visitors, had established itself as a permanent fixture in Venice's cultural landscape, despite being housed in a building that was itself impermanent, sinking with the rest of the city into the lagoon at a rate that was measurable, inevitable, and ignored by everyone who lived there. The collection had grown more valuable as the artists she had championed gained historical importance. The Pollocks alone were worth millions now, enough to make her wealthy again if she sold them, but selling meant admitting that the collection was investment rather than legacy, that she had been accumulating assets rather than preserving culture. She kept everything, stored paintings in rooms that were increasingly damp, where humidity damaged canvases in ways that conservation would eventually reveal. Her financial situation had stabilized only because she had stopped spending. The trust income continued at reduced levels, enough to maintain the Palazzo and pay staff, but not enough for the acquisitions and projects that had consumed previous decades. She was living on what remained of her inheritance, watching it deplete slowly, calculating whether it would last longer than she would. The visitors who came to see the collection changed over the years. In the 1950s, they had been mostly serious, art historians, critics, collectors who understood what they were seeing. By the late 1960s, tourism had transformed Venice into a destination for people who wanted to see famous places rather than understand them. They came to the Palazzo because guidebooks mentioned it, took photographs of paintings they did not recognize, asked questions that revealed they had no context for what they were looking at. Peggy continued giving tours when she felt like it, which was rarely. She would appear in the galleries without warning, would begin talking about paintings to whoever was standing nearest, would tell stories that were sometimes accurate and sometimes shaped by decades of repetition into forms that served her narrative rather than historical fact. She claimed to have discovered artists she had merely collected, attributed to herself influence she had not possessed, described relationships as more intimate or significant than they had been. The staff who managed the Palazzo learned to work around her. She would make decisions about exhibitions or conservation that made no practical sense, would insist on hanging paintings in locations that damaged them or made viewing difficult, would fire assistants for reasons she could not articulate, and would forget she had fired them by the next day. Her eccentricity, which had once seemed like bohemian freedom, had hardened into something closer to impairment. She was lonely in ways she had been lonely her entire life, but now without the energy to disguise it through affairs or acquisitions or projects. The men who had once been willing to sleep with her in exchange for money had moved on to younger, wealthier women. The artists who had tolerated her company for access to her collection were dead or famous enough to not need her. The friends she had made in Venice were mostly expatriates like herself, people who had come to the city to escape places that had rejected them, and who would die in Venice for the same reasons they had arrived. Her dogs were her primary companions. She had several at any given time, small breeds that required constant attention, that snapped at visitors who tried to pet them, that urinated on floors cleaned by staff who were paid to manage the palazzo, but not to clean up after animals. She talked to the dogs constantly, narrated her days to them, asked them questions, and interpreted their silence as agreement. Sinbad visited occasionally, appearing in Venice when he needed money or when guilt about Pegin's death momentarily overcame his resentment. The visits were brief, tense, marked by conversations where Peggy tried to establish connection and Sinbad responded with the minimum engagement necessary to maintain access to her remaining resources. He was in his 50s now, had accomplished nothing he could point to with pride, lived on family money he had not earned and could not preserve. Her grandchildren, Pegin's sons, were teenagers and young adults by the 1970s, living in Paris, carrying forward patterns that had originated with Peggy and that she could see reflected in them across generations. One of them painted, showed some of the same talent Pegin had shown, and would struggle with the same question of whether his work mattered independently or only because of the name he carried. The palazzo itself was deteriorating faster than she could maintain it. The foundation was unsound, had always been unsound, would eventually require repairs that cost more than the building was worth. Water seeped through walls, mold grew in corners. The smell of decay pervaded rooms where priceless art hung in conditions that conservators would later describe as criminal negligence. She made no plans to address this. The agreement with the Guggenheim Foundation meant the collection would be preserved after her death, but preserving it was their problem, not hers. She would live in the palazzo until she could not, would maintain it as well as her diminishing resources allowed, and whatever happened after that would happen without her involvement or concern. In 1976, she was 78 years old, visibly failing, walking with difficulty, forgetting conversations within minutes of having them. The staff managed her more than she managed the palazzo, made decisions they would have previously consulted her about, maintained the fiction that she was still in control while actually running everything around her decline. She still went to the window overlooking the Grand Canal most mornings, stood watching boats pass, tourists photographing churches, the city performing its role as beautiful corpse for visitors who would take pictures and leave. She had lived in Venice for 30 years, had become part of its population of permanent exiles, had spent her inheritance maintaining a collection that would outlive her, but that existed primarily as evidence of choices made decades earlier. The wealth that had defined her life had made it possible to flee New York, to collect art, to maintain the palazzo, to live without working, to survive failures that would have destroyed someone without money, had purchased almost nothing that lasted. Her marriages had failed. Her relationships with her children had failed. The museum she had built in New York had closed. The artists she had supported had either died or moved on to patrons who served their needs better. What remained was the collection. Paintings and sculptures she had acquired through decades of obsessive accumulation. Pieces that represented the only consistent thread in a life marked otherwise by chaos and escape. They hung in a palazzo that was sinking, managed by staff who would outlive her, waiting to be transferred to an institution that would preserve them for reasons she would never know and could not control. She stood at the window looking out at water that would eventually consume the city, understanding that survival was temporary for everyone and everything, that Venice would sink and the palazzo would crumble and the collection would be moved somewhere safe, and that none of this would mean anything she had wanted it to mean. Peggy Guggenheim died in her palazzo on December 23, 1979. She was 81 years old. The cause was stroke, the final failure in a body that had been failing incrementally for years. She died in the building she had purchased for less than a single painting now cost, surrounded by art that had outlived most of the people who had created it. The collection passed to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, as arranged. The palazzo became a museum bearing her name, maintained by the institution her uncle had built. Preserved in the city where she had chosen to live primarily because it asked nothing of her, except money. Tourists visit now in numbers she never saw during her lifetime, move through galleries she had walked through alone with her dogs, photograph paintings she had acquired from desperate artists in occupied Paris and depressed New York. Her children had preceded her in death. Pagan by suicide in 1967, Sinbad from liver failure in 1986, 7 years after his mother. Her grandchildren inherited what remained of the family money, carried the name forward into generations that would know the Guggenheims primarily as museum founders, rather than as people who had extracted copper from mountains using labor they never witnessed. The palazzo still sits on the Grand Canal, still unfinished, still sinking. Conservators now manage humidity levels, monitor the paintings for deterioration, do the work Peggy had ignored or could not afford. The collection she assembled through decades of compulsive acquisition has been cataloged, studied, written about, absorbed into art history as evidence of patronage during modernism's crucial years. Whether any of it mattered in ways she wanted it to matter remains unclear. She had wanted to be important, to be remembered, to prove that a Guggenheim daughter with the wrong face and the wrong temperament could still leave a mark that outlasted the copper mines she had never seen. She had wanted belonging and received tolerance. She had wanted love and received transactions. She had wanted to be necessary and became useful. The art survived. The palazzo survived. Her name survived, attached to both. What she had wanted from any of it, what she had been searching for in marriages that failed and affairs that ended and acquisitions that never stopped, she never found and did not recognize, or recognized too late to matter. The water continues rising. The paintings remain.